Have you ever sat at a holiday table with family who smiled warmly while secretly despising everything about you? That's exactly how it felt that Thanksgiving Day, seated in my husband's ancestral home, surrounded by his relatives who pretended to welcome me while their eyes revealed nothing but contempt. Their laughter wasn't joyful. It was weaponized, aimed directly at my heart like perfectly timed arrows, and I was bleeding out before we even served the cranberry sauce. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was our first Thanksgiving hosted at the Anderson estate since Richard and I had married. The sprawling Victorian in Massachusetts had been in his family for generations, and his parents had finally relented to let us host the holiday after 3 years of marriage. I had spent weeks planning this dinner, handwriting place cards with calligraphy pens, polishing the heirloom silver that had graced Anderson family gatherings since the 1800s, and preparing family recipes I'd carefully extracted from Richard's reluctant mother, Eleanor. I wanted this dinner to prove my worthiness, to show I belonged among their distinguished lineage, despite my questionable background, as Eleanor so delicately phrased it. Instead, it became the moment when every carefully constructed facade in our lives came crashing down around us. We had just finished the pumpkin pie when Richard's father, Judge William Anderson, tapped his crystal glass with a silver spoon and stood with all the authority of his courtroom presence. He looked around the table, his steel-gray eyes landing on me with particular coldness before shifting to my son Jacob from my first marriage. "I think it's time we address the elephant in the room," he announced. "This charade has gone on long enough." At first, I thought he was making an awkward toast. My fingers nervously twisted the linen napkin in my lap as I forced a polite smile. But then I saw Eleanor's face, her thin lips curled into a satisfied smirk. Richard's brother Charles nodded knowingly, while his wife Victoria whispered something behind her hand. My mother, the only ally I'd invited, looked stricken. "We know what you've been doing, Olivia," William continued, his voice carrying the weight of a verdict. "Using our son for his name, for this house, for our family's position. We've been tolerating it for Richard's sake, but we can't ignore the evidence anymore." The room fell into a terrible silence, the kind where you can hear your own heartbeat hammering in your ears. Richard didn't defend me, didn't stand up to say, "Father, that's enough." He simply stared at his plate, a muscle twitching in his jaw. I looked at Jacob, my bright, observant 12-year-old who never missed anything. He had stopped eating, his fork suspended midair, his eyes darting between the adults. The hurt and confusion on his face broke something inside me. I had spent 3 years trying to shield him from the Anderson family's subtle cruelty, their backhanded compliments about how surprisingly well-mannered he was, their constant references to his unfortunate circumstances. Now they weren't bothering to hide it anymore. Truth is, I had never been good enough for the Andersons. I was a 32-year-old single mother working as a librarian when I met Richard at a fundraising gala I was catering on the side for extra income. Richard, with his prestigious surgical practice and impeccable pedigree, had seemed so far out of my league that I initially mistook his interest for pity. But he pursued me relentlessly, charmed Jacob completely, and proposed within 6 months. My father had died when I was young, and my mother, Rosa, had raised me alone on a teacher's salary. She loved Richard but warned me about the world I was entering. "Those people live by different rules, Mija," she'd said the night before our wedding. "Don't lose yourself trying to become one of them." Maybe I should have listened. Over 3 years, I had gradually transformed myself, straightening my naturally curly hair, modulating my voice to eliminate any hint of the neighborhood where I grew up, replacing my colorful wardrobe with muted tones that Eleanor deemed appropriate. I had become increasingly anxious, second-guessing every decision, measuring my words carefully, all to avoid the disapproving glances and whispered critiques. And now, at my own dinner table, William Anderson was confirming what I had feared. All along, I would never truly be accepted. What hurt most was Richard's silence. The same silence that had grown between us over months as he spent increasingly longer hours at the hospital, as he began taking calls in another room, as the warmth that had initially drawn me to him cooled into polite distance. Before I could find my voice, Jacob pushed his chair back and stood up. My son, still lanky in his growth spurt, wearing the burgundy sweater vest he'd insisted on because it matched Richard's, stood taller than I'd ever seen him. I reached for his hand to pull him back, to shield him from whatever was happening, but he moved away. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking directly at Judge Anderson with an expression of such determined composure that the entire table went still. "I have something you all need to hear," Jacob said, his voice surprisingly steady. The room completely stilled. Eleanor's perpetual smile faltered. Charles stopped mid-whisper to Victoria. Richard's head snapped up, his eyes finally meeting mine with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Fear? All attention turned to Jacob, and in that moment, something shifted in the air. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about him, about what he was about to do. I'll never forget the look in his eyes, clear, unflinching, older than his years. I had always thought of Jacob as sensitive, sometimes too perceptive for his own good. He noticed everything, felt everything deeply. He'd been the one to wipe my tears after particularly difficult family gatherings, asking questions I couldn't answer honestly. Why doesn't Grandma Eleanor like our apartment pictures? Why does Uncle Charles always ask about my real dad? I had protected him as best I could, but children see more than we realize. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers, still with traces of childhood roundness, navigated to something with practiced precision. He placed the phone in the center of the table, next to the crystal centerpiece I had arranged with autumn leaves and candles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I made a recording," he said simply. "I think everyone should listen to it." The funny thing about turning points is you don't recognize them until you're already spinning in a new direction. Thanksgiving was supposed to be my moment of triumph, proof that I had successfully integrated into the Anderson family. The Victorian mansion had been my dream home since the first time Richard brought me there. 4 stories of history and tradition, with its wraparound porch and original stained glass windows. When Eleanor reluctantly handed over hosting duties, claiming her arthritis made the work too difficult, I had been ecstatic. Finally, a chance to prove myself worthy. I had spent months preparing, studying old photo albums to understand how the Andersons arranged their holiday tables, questioning Richard about family traditions, even consulting with their longtime housekeeper about Eleanor's secret recipes. I wanted everything to be perfect, from the turkey brined exactly as his grandmother had done it to the precise folding of the napkins. Richard had watched my preparations with amusement that gradually transformed into concern. "They're just people, Olivia," he'd said one night as I practiced piping designs on test pies at 2 a.m. "You don't need to try so hard." But he was wrong. They weren't just people. They were the Andersons of Beacon Hill, whose ancestors had signed the Declaration of Independence, whose family name graced hospital wings and university buildings. And I was the daughter of an immigrant teacher from the wrong side of town, with a son from a relationship that had ended before vows were ever exchanged. Of course, I needed to try hard. I needed to be exceptional just to be considered adequate. The morning of Thanksgiving, I woke before dawn. I kissed Jacob's forehead as he slept, his room in the third-floor turret that he loved because it made him feel like a character in a fantasy book. I tiptoed down the winding staircase to the kitchen with its professional-grade appliances. That had intimidated me when we first moved in. By 9, the turkey was in the oven, filling the house with the scent of herbs and butter. I had made cranberry sauce from berries I'd personally selected at a local farm, assembled 3 different kinds of stuffing to accommodate various preferences, and prepared the dough for Parker House rolls that needed to rise by the fire, for the proper texture, according to Eleanor's handwritten recipe cards. At 10, I showered quickly and applied makeup with trembling hands, choosing a sophisticated burgundy dress that Eleanor had once complimented as suitable. I twisted my hair into an elegant chignon, added pearl earrings that had been a wedding gift from William and Eleanor, and spritzed on the expensive perfume Richard had given me for our anniversary. Subtle and appropriate, nothing like the fruity scents I once preferred. Jacob emerged from his room in his dress clothes, hair combed neatly to the side. At 12, he was already showing signs of the handsome young man he would become, with his thoughtful brown eyes and serious expressions. "Do I look okay?" he asked, tugging at his collar. "You look perfect," I assured him, straightening his sweater vest. "Thank you for dressing up. It means a lot to Richard's family." A shadow crossed his face. "They're supposed to be my family too, right? That's what Richard said when you got married." I hugged him, careful not to wrinkle either of our outfits. "Of course they are, sweetheart. It just takes time sometimes for families to blend completely." 3 years is a long time, he said, with that disconcerting perception that sometimes made me wonder who was parenting whom. Richard had been called to the hospital for an emergency surgery the night before, but he arrived home just before noon, looking tired but impeccable in his tailored suit. He kissed my cheek absently, complimenting the smell of the food without really looking at any of it. "They'll be here at 1, he said, checking his watch. "Father's bringing the good wine from his cellar, and Mother's bringing her silver gravy. Boat. She doesn't trust ours, apparently." The slight edge in his voice gave me hope that perhaps he recognized the absurdity of his mother's implicit criticism. I squeezed his hand. "Everything's going to be perfect." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Olivia, you know my family can be traditional. Don't take anything personally today, all right?" Before I could ask what he meant, the doorbell rang precisely at 1 o'clock. The Andersons were nothing if not punctual. Eleanor entered first, air-kissing my cheeks without making contact, her critical gaze already sweeping the entryway for flaws. William followed, clasping Richard's shoulder firmly while offering me a curt nod. Charles and Victoria arrived with their twin daughters, 8-year-olds dressed identically in velvet dresses that probably cost more than my monthly student loan payment. My mother arrived last, bringing her famous Tres Leches cake, despite my gentle suggestion that the Andersons preferred traditional pumpkin pie. The contrast between her warm embraces and the Andersons' stiff formality couldn't have been more stark. The first hour passed in a blur of controlled chaos. Eleanor inspected my table settings, rearranging the silverware the proper way, when she thought I wasn't looking. William discussed hospital politics with Richard in the study, while Charles interrogated Jacob about his grades in what felt more like a cross-examination than friendly interest. Victoria and my mother sat in uncomfortable silence in the living room, separated by generations of different expectations about what constituted polite conversation. By the time we sat down to eat, my stomach was in knots. I served each dish with commentary about its preparation, trying to demonstrate my respect for Anderson traditions. Eleanor tasted each one with the solemnity of a food critic, offering faint praise that felt like condemnation. "The turkey is adequate. Not dry at all, which is an achievement for someone who didn't grow up with proper instruction." William. "Carved with surgical precision, distributing white and dark meat according to each person's preference without having to ask. A family tradition I had carefully noted." Conversation flowed around me, never quite including me. Hospital fundraisers I hadn't attended, family friends I hadn't met, childhood stories that always seemed to exclude Richard's new life. Jacob tried valiantly to participate, offering thoughtful comments that were acknowledged briefly before the adults returned to their insular discussions. My mother watched it all with increasingly narrowed eyes, occasionally squeezing my hand under the table. I could feel her growing anger on my behalf, but I silently pleaded with her to stay quiet. This was my challenge to overcome. My family, to integrate into. I thought we had made it through relatively unscathed when Eleanor suggested moving to the living room for dessert and coffee. That's when everything changed. That's when William stood up and decided it was time to stop pretending. After his accusation hung in the air and Jacob stood up with his phone, the silence in the dining room became absolute. Even the antique grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to hold its ticking in suspense. "Jacob, sit down." Richard finally spoke, his voice tight with warning. "This isn't the time." But Jacob didn't move. His finger hovered over the play button on his phone screen. "Everyone talks about evidence," he said, looking directly at Judge Anderson. "I have some too." Before anyone could stop him, he pressed play. The sound quality wasn't perfect, a recording made from a distance, muffled by walls or doors. But the voices were unmistakable. Richard and his father, in what sounded like the study. "The prenup protects the estate, son. That was never in question." William's distinctive baritone filled the dining room. "But she's starting to ask questions." Richard's voice, sounding stressed. "About the trust, about the summer house. She keeps talking about taking Jacob there next year." A derisive laugh from William. "That place has been in our family for 5 generations. I'm not about to let some gold digger and her illegitimate son stake a claim on Anderson property." "Dad, don't call them that." Richard's protest sounded weak, perfunctory. "Call them what? What they are? Richard, we've tolerated this phase. Of yours. The charitable impulse is admirable, but it's gone on long enough. The board position opens next month. Barrett's daughter is back from Europe, single again. She's always had a soft spot for you, and that merger would be advantageous for both families." "What are you suggesting?" A pause in the recording. Then William, his voice lower but still clear. "I'm suggesting you consider your future. Your real future. The Anderson legacy doesn't include librarians from questionable backgrounds or children from God knows where." Another pause, longer this time. I felt every second like a physical pain in my chest. Then Richard's voice, resigned and hollow. "I'll think about it." Jacob stopped the recording. The dining room remained silent, but it was a different quality of silence now, heavy with exposed truth rather than suppressed disdain. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't look at Richard, though I felt his eyes on me. The conversations I'd overheard in fragments, the phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered rooms, the gradual withdrawal, it all crystallized into this terrible clarity. Eleanor recovered first. "Jacob, dear, it's very rude to record people's private conversations. I'm sure your mother has taught you better manners than that." Jacob didn't flinch. "I wasn't trying to record anything. I was looking for Richard because I needed help with my science project. My phone was already recording because I was practicing my presentation." His voice was steady, factual. "But when I heard what Judge Anderson said about my mom being a gold digger and me being illegitimate, I saved it." He looked around the table, his young face remarkably composed. "I saved it because I knew nobody would believe me if I just told what I heard." Charles cleared his throat uncomfortably. Victoria suddenly became very interested in rearranging her dessert fork. My mother's face was thunder, her hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles had gone white. William's authoritative mask slipped, revealing momentary discomfort before he recovered. "Context is important in legal matters," he said dismissively. "This recording lacks proper context and could be interpreted in multiple ways. What's the proper context for calling my grandson illegitimate?" My mother's voice cut through the room, quiet but razor sharp. It was the first time she had directly challenged any of the Andersons, and the surprise on their faces would have been comical in any other situation. Richard still hadn't spoken. He sat frozen in his chair, looking between his father and me like he couldn't decide which disaster to address first. I found my voice at last, though it came out surprisingly calm considering the hurricane of emotions inside me. "Jacob, you didn't tell me about this." He met my eyes directly. "I was waiting. I wanted to see if Richard would tell you himself. Or stand up for us." He turned to Richard, and the hurt in his eyes was unbearable. "You said you were going to be my dad. Real dads protect their families." Richard flinched as if he'd been struck. "Jacob, it's complicated." "It's not complicated," Jacob interrupted with a certainty that belied his 12 years. "Either you think we're good enough for your family, or you don't." I stood up then, my legs surprisingly steady beneath me. The room had become too small, too airless, too filled with 3 years of pretense. I looked at each Anderson face in turn. Eleanor's tight disapproval, William's cold calculation, Charles and Victoria's embarrassed discomfort. Then I looked at Richard, still sitting in stunned silence. "We're leaving," I said simply. "Jacob, please get your coat." "Olivia, don't be dramatic," Eleanor started. "Family disagreements happen, but storming out solves nothing." I turned to her with a clarity I had never felt in her presence before. "We're not family. You've made that abundantly clear. We never were." Richard finally stood, reaching for my arm. "Olivia, please, let's discuss this privately." I stepped away from his touch. "There's nothing left to discuss. Your father outlined your options quite clearly, and your silence made your choice evident." William attempted to regain control of the situation. "This emotional outburst is precisely why these matters should be handled with discretion, Richard." Something in me snapped at his condescending tone. 3 years of careful accommodation, of swallowed retorts and bitten tongues, of teaching Jacob to be twice as polite and half as visible, all of it crystallized into a moment of perfect, liberating fury. "No, Judge Anderson," I said, my voice steady despite the anger coursing through me. "This emotional outburst is what happens when people with questionable backgrounds discover they've been lied to, when children who apparently come from God knows where realize they've been tolerated rather than welcomed." I turned to Jacob, who stood tall beside me now, his young face a mixture of pain and pride. "We deserve better than tolerance. Both of us." My mother was already gathering her purse, her expression fierce with protective love. "Mija, the car is outside. Let's go home." Home. Not this beautiful cold house with its generations of exclusion built into the very walls. Home to our apartment that I'd kept just in case, the place Eleanor had visited once and called quaint, with such disdain. The place with mismatched furniture and walls covered in Jacob's artwork and photos of people who actually loved us. As we moved toward the door, Richard followed, panic finally breaking through his shock. "Olivia, wait. Jacob, please. This isn't what it sounds like." Jacob paused at the doorway, turning back to the man he had come to think of as his father. In that moment, my son looked both younger and older than his 12 years, vulnerable in his hurt, but ancient in his wisdom. "I really wanted you to be my dad," he said simply. "I guess family isn't about big houses or fancy names. It's about who stands up for you when it matters." The door closed behind us with a quiet click, not the dramatic slam that might have felt satisfying in the moment. But somehow, that gentle closure felt more final, more dignified. In the car, Jacob leaned against me, finally allowing himself to cry, while my mother drove in protective silence. I held him close, my own tears falling into his hair, and whispered the only truth that mattered. "You were so brave. I'm so proud of you." The funny thing about courage is that sometimes it comes from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes it takes a child's clarity to cut through the knots of adult compromise and self-deception. As we drove away from the Anderson estate, leaving behind the turkey and trimmings, the heirloom silver and crystal, I realized we hadn't lost anything of real value. We had found something infinitely more precious: our dignity, our truth, and each other. The drive back to our apartment felt surreal, like we were floating through someone else's life rather than our own. The familiar streets of our old neighborhood came into view: modest brownstones with window boxes, corner stores with hand-painted signs, none of the manicured perfection of Beacon Hill. Jacob had stopped crying, but he remained silent, his head against my shoulder as my mother navigated the evening traffic. The sky had darkened to that peculiar shade of purple-gray that comes before the first snowfall, fitting for the cold reality we were facing. "We still have leftovers from yesterday at my house," my mother said, breaking the silence. "I made your favorite pozole. Not traditional Thanksgiving food, but..." "It's perfect, Mama," I said, squeezing her shoulder. Comfort food from my childhood sounded infinitely better than the elaborate meal we'd abandoned. Our apartment building looked smaller than I remembered, dwarfed by newer developments on either side. I'd kept paying rent on it these 3 years, telling Richard it was a smart investment we could eventually rent out. In truth, it had been my safety net, the place that still felt like ours, mine and Jacob's, with no Anderson fingerprints on the walls or expectations in the air. The key, stuck in the lock the way it always had, requiring that particular upward jiggle I'd almost forgotten. The familiar scent enveloped us. Books and the lavender sachets I made each spring, nothing like the Anderson home's expensive potpourri and furniture polish. Jacob walked directly to his old bedroom, which we'd maintained with his favorite, space-themed bedding and bookshelves still full of dog-eared paperbacks. My mother busied herself in the kitchen, the sounds of pots clanging a comforting soundtrack from my childhood. I stood in the center of our living room, suddenly overwhelmed by everything that had happened. My phone buzzed repeatedly in my purse. Richard, undoubtedly. But I couldn't bear to look at it yet. "Mom?" Jacob called from his room. I found him sitting on his bed, holding the framed photo of the 3 of us, Richard, Jacob, and me, taken on our wedding day. Jacob had been 9 then, beaming with hope in his little suit, Richard's arm around his shoulders in what had seemed like a promise. "Did you know?" he asked, his voice small. "About what they thought of us?" I sat beside him, choosing my words carefully. I knew they had reservations, but I thought they were getting past them. I thought Richard was different. He let them talk about us like that. It wasn't a question, but a statement, heavy with disillusionment. "Yes," I admitted. "He did." "Why didn't you say anything? When they were being mean to you at dinners, or when Eleanor kept fixing things you did?" The question pierced through my carefully constructed justifications. Why had I tolerated it? Why had I taught my brilliant, sensitive son to shrink himself to fit into spaces that weren't designed for us? "I thought I was protecting our future," I said finally. "I thought if I just tried harder, was more perfect, they'd eventually accept us. I was wrong, and I'm so sorry I put you through that." He nodded, processing this with the seriousness that had always characterized him. "You don't have to be perfect for people to love you, Mom." My eyes filled with tears at the wisdom from my child. A lesson I'd always taught him but failed to apply to myself. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been smart. You tell me that all the time." A ghost of his usual smile appeared, and I felt a surge of hope that perhaps we hadn't lost everything today. My mother appeared in the doorway, wooden spoon in hand. "Dinner in 15 minutes. Jacob, would you help me set the table? The real plates, not paper. This is still Thanksgiving." As Jacob followed her to the kitchen, I finally checked my phone. 12 missed calls from Richard, 3 voicemails, and a flurry of texts that progressed from confused to desperate. "Where are you? Please come back so we can talk. You're overreacting." My father didn't mean it the way it sounded. Jacob shouldn't have been eavesdropping. "Olivia, please, I love you. This isn't fair." The last one sent a surge of anger through me. Fair? Was it fair to let his family undermine me for years? Was it fair to discuss replacing us while pretending to build a life together? Was it fair for my son to discover his stepfather's true feelings through an accidentally recorded conversation? I silenced my phone and joined my family at our small dining table. My mother had laid out her mismatched china, pieces collected, over decades from thrift stores and garage sales, each with its own story. Jacob had filled water glasses and was arranging napkins with the same careful precision he applied to everything. As we sat down to our improvised Thanksgiving meal of day-old pozole, cornbread, and a hastily assembled salad, my mother reached for our hands. "We give thanks for family, real family, that stands together in truth, for courage that reveals what needs to be seen, and for new beginnings, which are always possible." Jacob squeezed my hand, and I felt something shift within me. The shame and humiliation began to transform into something else. Determination, perhaps, or self-respect. We ate and talked, really talked, without measuring our words or monitoring our laughter. Jacob recounted stories from school that he'd never shared at the Anderson dinner table, and my mother told jokes in Spanglish that would have made Eleanor wince. For the first time in 3 years, I felt myself expanding back into the space of my own personality, no longer carefully contained within Anderson-approved boundaries. After dinner, as Jacob helped my mother with dishes, insisting it wasn't a chore but a tradition, I finally stepped onto the apartment's small balcony and called Richard back. "Olivia, thank God," he answered immediately. "Where are you? Are you okay? I've been worried sick." "We're at the apartment," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "We're fine." "I'm coming over. We need to talk about this in person. What Jacob did," I interrupted, "was tell the truth when no one else would. He's not the problem here, Richard. My father speaks carelessly sometimes. You know how he is. He doesn't actually mean stop." The word came out sharper than I intended. "Don't insult my intelligence any further. Your father meant exactly what he said, and you know it. The question is whether you meant what you said, or rather, what you didn't say." His silence confirmed what I already knew. "Are you really considering it?" I asked, the question that had been burning inside me since Jacob played the recording. Barrett's daughter in the board position, the real future your father outlined? It's not that simple, Olivia. There are family expectations, obligations, that go back generations. It is that simple. Either you love us, both of us, enough to stand up for us, or you don't. Of course I love you. His voice cracked with what sounded like genuine distress. But you have to understand my position. I understand perfectly, I said quietly. You want us when it's convenient, when we're alone in our bubble. But you won't choose us when it matters, when there's a cost. That's not fair. Life rarely is, especially for people with questionable backgrounds like me. The bitterness seeped through despite my efforts to remain calm. Don't come here tonight, Richard. We all need space to think. This isn't how we should handle this. We're married, for God's sake. Yes, we are, with a prenuptial agreement that protects the estate, as your father so helpfully reminded you. The realization struck me fully for the first time. That's why you married me instead of just continuing to date, isn't it? The prenup gave you an exit strategy if your charitable impulse ran its course. His hesitation told me everything. It wasn't like that in the beginning, he finally said. I really did fall in love with you. The past tense wasn't lost on me, but not enough to imagine a lifetime together. Not enough to defend us to your family. Olivia. I need to go. Jacob needs me. I ended the call before emotion could overtake my resolve, then stood on the balcony watching the first snowflakes begin to fall. They melted as soon as they touched the ground, too insubstantial to accumulate yet, like promises that dissolve when tested by reality. When I came back, inside, Jacob was sitting at the kitchen counter, a mug of hot chocolate cradled in his hands. He looked up when I entered, his eyes too knowing for a 12-year-old. "Is Richard coming here?" he asked. "Not tonight." I sat beside him, accepting the mug my mother silently offered. "We all need some time to think." Jacob nodded, relief, evident in the relaxation of his shoulders. "I don't hate him, Mom. I just don't understand why he didn't stand up for us. Sometimes people get caught between who they want to be and who they've been raised to be," I said carefully. "It doesn't excuse his choices, but it might explain them." My mother snorted softly from where she was wiping down the counter. "Men who cannot stand up to their families do not deserve to start families of their own." The simple truth of it resonated through me. I had spent 3 years making excuses for Richard's silences, his acquiescence to his family's subtle cruelties. I had attributed it to conflict avoidance, to the complicated dynamics of old money families, to anything but the most obvious explanation. He lacked the courage to choose us completely. That night, the three of us watched old movies on our slightly outdated television, laughing at familiar jokes and finishing each other's favorite lines. Jacob fell asleep on the couch, his head in my lap like when he was younger. As I stroked his hair, my mother watched us with the particular blend of love and worry that defines motherhood. "What will you do now, Olivia?" she finally asked. "I don't know," I admitted. "I need to talk to Richard again when I'm calmer. Figure out if there's anything left to salvage." She nodded, though her expression suggested she'd already drawn her conclusions. "Whatever you decide, remember this feeling, this freedom to be yourself. Don't trade it away again. Not for any man, not for any house, not for any name." After she left and I had tucked Jacob into his bed, I lay awake in my old bedroom, surrounded by books I'd loved enough to keep but not important enough to bring to the Anderson house. Everything in this apartment represented choices made before I'd started editing myself to fit someone else's expectations. Bright throw pillows, eclectic art, shelves overflowing with diverse authors. When had I decided these things weren't sophisticated enough? When had I started believing that my taste, my background, my essence needed improvement? Richard called again the next morning. Then again that afternoon. By evening, he was at our door. "Please," he said when I opened it just enough to see his face. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." He looked terrible, unshaven, hair disheveled, still wearing yesterday's clothes. The scent of expensive whiskey clung to him. My first instinct was concern, the caretaking response I'd cultivated throughout our marriage. I suppressed it. "Jacob's asleep," I said. "I don't want to wake him. Then let's talk in the hallway." His eyes were bloodshot but determined. "Please, Olivia. I've been thinking about everything. About what my father said. About how I responded." Against my better judgment, I stepped into the hallway, closing the apartment door behind me. The narrow corridor with its scuffed walls and flickering fluorescent light was a far cry from the Anderson estate's elegant interiors. Richard looked profoundly out of place in his rumpled designer clothes. "I'm sorry," he said immediately. "I should have defended you, defended both of you. There's no excuse." "You're right," I said. "There isn't." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident in every movement. "What do you want me to say, Olivia? That I've been a coward? Fine, I've been a coward. That I've let my family influence me too much? I have. But that doesn't mean I don't love you." Love isn't passive, Richard. It's not something you just feel. It's what you do, the choices you make, the stands you take. I leaned against the wall, suddenly tired. You chose silence, repeatedly. I'll make it right. I'll talk to my parents, make them understand. This isn't about making your parents understand. It's about whether you understand. I looked at him directly, this man I had loved enough to reshape myself for. Your silence hurt us, but Jacob's courage showed me something I'd been missing. He refused to make himself smaller for people who couldn't appreciate him, while I've spent 3 years doing exactly that. Richard reached for my hand, and I let him take it, remembering how safe his touch had once made me feel. We can start over, set better boundaries with my family. Can we? Because your father wasn't just speaking for himself yesterday. He was articulating the plan you've been considering. The convenient exit strategy when your phase with the librarian ran its course. His grip tightened. It wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Richard? Explain it to me. Explain how you could listen to your father call your stepson illegitimate and not walk out immediately. Explain how you could contemplate trading us for a better social match as if we were stocks to be upgraded. He had no answer, at least not one he could articulate. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we'd never said to each other. I need time, I finally said, reclaiming my hand. And so does Jacob. He trusted you completely, and now that trust is broken. How much time? There was a hint of the entitled impatience that characterized his family, the assumption that problems could be resolved on their preferred timeline. I don't know. This isn't a medical procedure you can schedule, Richard. Real healing doesn't work that way. He flinched at the reference to his professional life, where everything was organized, predictable, under his control. What about Christmas, the hospital charity gala? People will talk if we're not there together. The fact that his mind had gone immediately to social appearances rather than emotional repair told me everything I needed to know. People talking about us is the least of my concerns right now, I said. My priority is helping Jacob process this betrayal and figuring out what I want for our future. Our future, he repeated, seizing on the phrase. So you still see one for us? I hesitated, unwilling to offer false hope, but equally unwilling to make permanent decisions in the raw aftermath of yesterday's revelations. I don't know yet, but I do know that if there is any chance for us, things will have to change fundamentally. Not just with your family, but with you. With us. He nodded, relief visible in the loosening of his shoulders. I can change. I will change. This isn't just about you changing, Richard. It's about me changing too. Changing back into someone who doesn't compromise her dignity for acceptance. I reached for the doorknob. Go home. Get some sleep. We'll talk again when we're both clearer. Will you at least answer if I call tomorrow? Yes, I promised, but not for Jacob. He needs more time. After he left, I leaned against the closed door, exhaustion washing over me. The confrontation that should have happened years ago had finally occurred, but it offered no immediate catharsis, no clean resolution. Just the messy, complicated reality of a relationship built partially on mutual deception. Richard pretending his family would eventually accept us. Me pretending I could become what they wanted. Inside, I found Jacob sitting at the kitchen counter, a glass of water in his hands. You heard? I said. It wasn't a question. He nodded. Most of it. I sat beside him, not bothering to pretend this was a conversation he was too young to participate. And yesterday had changed that pretense forever. What are you thinking? He considered the question with his characteristic thoughtfulness. I'm thinking that Richard loves us, but not enough. Not enough to be brave. The simple assessment struck me with its accuracy. That's a very grown-up observation. Being a kid doesn't mean I don't see things, Mom. He fiddled with his glass. At school, there's this quote on the wall in my English class. It says, "Courage is not the absence of fear, but rather the judgment that something else is more important than fear." I think about it a lot. That's from Ambrose Redmoon, I said automatically, the librarian in me identifying the source. It's a good definition of courage. I was really scared yesterday, Jacob admitted. My hands were shaking when I played that recording, but I was more scared of letting them keep hurting you. I pulled him into a hug, this child who had shown more backbone than all the adults at that Thanksgiving table combined. You were magnificent, but you shouldn't have had to be the one to stand up. Sometimes kids have to show grown-ups what's right, he said simply, like in those books we read together, where the children see the truth that adults miss. I smiled at the reference to our nightly reading sessions, something we'd maintained even in the Anderson house, though Eleanor had disapproved of the common fantasy novels we preferred. "What do you want to happen now?" I asked him. "With Richard? With everything?" He thought about it seriously. "I want him to be brave enough to really be my dad. But if he can't?" He shrugged, trying to appear casual, though I could see the hurt beneath. Then we were fine before him, and we'll be fine after. The resilience in his statement brought fresh tears to my eyes. Yes, we will. Whatever happens, we have each other. And that's not nothing, it's everything. I sent him back to bed with a kiss on his forehead and a promise that he would be included in all decisions about our future. As I tidied the kitchen, I found myself humming softly, a habit I'd suppressed in the Anderson house where Eleanor considered it common. The simple pleasure of this unconscious expression felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. 3 years of careful self-editing had taken their toll, I realized. I had gradually surrendered pieces of my identity, my music, my colorful clothes, my outspoken opinions, my heritage, trying to become the kind of woman who belonged in Richard's world. In that process, I had taught Jacob to do the same, to mute his natural enthusiasm, to choose his words carefully, to never risk appearing inappropriate. Yet yesterday, when it mattered most, Jacob had found the courage to be fully himself, to speak uncomfortable truths regardless of the consequences. My son had intuitively recognized what I had forgotten, that sacrificing your authentic self for acceptance creates only the illusion of belonging, never the reality. As snow continued to fall outside our windows, transforming the city into something softer and quieter, I made a promise to myself. Whatever happened with Richard, whether our marriage survived this crucible or not, I would never again teach my son that shrinking himself was the price of admission to someone else's world. Some prices were simply too high, no matter how elegant the house or how distinguished the family name. The most valuable inheritance I could offer Jacob wasn't social position or family connections. It was the courage to stand firmly in his truth, even when, especially when, it would be easier to remain silent. Yesterday, against all expectations, he had offered that inheritance to me. The next morning, I woke to the unfamiliar sounds of my old apartment building, the radiator's rhythmic clanking, the muffled conversations of neighbors through thin walls, the distant rumble of the T train passing nearby. For a disorienting moment, I reached across the bed for Richard before remembering everything. Reality crashed back with breathtaking force. I found Jacob already awake, sitting cross-legged on our small living room rug, surrounded by his collection of astronomy books. He looked up as I entered, his face brightening. "Mom, did you know there's going to be a meteor shower tonight? The Leonids. We could see it from the roof if it's clear." The simple normalcy of his interest touched me deeply. Despite everything that had happened, he was still my curious, wonder-filled boy. "That sounds perfect. Let's check the forecast later." I made coffee in our old percolator, another relic I'd abandoned in favor of the Andersons' sleek espresso machine. The rich aroma filled our small kitchen, comforting in its familiarity. As I poured a cup, my phone buzzed with a text from Richard. "Can we meet for lunch? Just to talk, please." I hesitated, my finger hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to delay, to protect the fragile sense of reclaimed peace I was feeling this morning. But avoiding difficult conversations had never solved anything. "Okay." The cafe near the library at 1 Sire. I chose the location deliberately, the small, unpretentious cafe where we'd had our first date, before I knew about his family's wealth or legacy. Before I started changing myself to fit his world. "Richard wants to meet for lunch," I told Jacob, settling beside him with my coffee. "How do you feel about spending a few hours with Abuela today?" He considered this, closing his book. "Are you going to tell him we're never coming back?" The directness of his question caught me off guard. "I don't know yet, honey. I'm going to listen to what he has to say and then make decisions carefully. But I promise, whatever happens, you and I will talk about it together." He nodded, satisfied with this answer. I think people deserve second chances if they're really sorry, but not third and fourth chances for the same mistake. That's what Ms. Rivera taught us about restorative justice in social studies. I smiled at his application of school lessons to our situation. "That's pretty wise. Where did you get so smart?" "From you," he said simply, returning to his book. "You always told me that it's not about being the loudest person in the room. It's about knowing when to speak up for what matters." His words echoed in my mind as I prepared for my meeting with Richard. I had indeed taught Jacob that principle, yet I had failed to apply it in my own life, choosing silence and accommodation over self-respect. The realization fueled my resolve as I dropped Jacob at my mother's apartment and walked the familiar blocks to the cafe. Richard was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 coffees, mine prepared exactly as I liked it. He stood when he saw me, his expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. He'd shaved and changed clothes since last night, but exhaustion still marked his features. "Thank you for coming," he said, as I took the seat across from him. I said I would. I accepted the coffee but didn't drink immediately. I keep my promises. The subtle rebuke wasn't lost on him. He winced slightly before gathering himself. "Olivia, I've been thinking about everything. About what happened at Thanksgiving, about what you said last night. You're right. I've been a coward. I've let my family dictate terms I should have rejected immediately. It's not just about your family, Richard. It's about us. About who we are together and separately." I looked around the cafe at the mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. "Do you remember our first date here?" He followed my gaze, a faint smile touching his lips. "You ordered black coffee and lemon cake. You were reading Garcia Marquez and had a smudge of ink on your fingers from the library stamps. And you told me you loved that I worked with books, that you'd always wanted to marry someone who could recommend the perfect novel for any mood." I paused, the memory bittersweet. "You said you were tired of the artificial people in your social circle, that you wanted something real." "I meant that," he insisted, leaning forward. "I still do." "Do you? Because somewhere along the way, you started expecting me to become exactly like the people you claimed to be tired of. More polished, less opinionated, more acceptable." He had the grace to look ashamed. I didn't realize I was doing that. "That's the problem, Richard. You didn't notice as I gradually erased myself piece by piece. You didn't object when your mother criticized my accent, or when your father dismissed my career as charming but inconsequential. You accepted the new, carefully edited version of me without question. I thought you were just adapting, finding your place." "No," I said quietly. I was disappearing. And worse, I was teaching Jacob to do the same, to make himself smaller, quieter, less authentically himself. Richard stared into his coffee. "I never wanted that for either of you." but you allowed it. And in that allowance was a kind of endorsement. I finally took a sip of my coffee, gathering courage for what needed to be said. The conversation Jacob recorded. You need to help me understand it. Were you really considering what your father suggested? About Barrett's daughter and ending our marriage? He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. It wasn't as calculated as it sounds, he finally said. My father has always had this vision for my life. The right career, the right connections, the right wife from the right family. When I married you, I genuinely thought I was breaking free from that blueprint. But then what? The novelty wore off? The reality of being married to someone who didn't fit the Anderson mold became too difficult? No, he protested, then hesitated. Maybe. I don't know. There was constant pressure, subtle remarks from my mother, pointed questions from my father, invitations that conspicuously excluded you. It was easier to compartmentalize, to keep our home life separate from my family life. Except I was never separate, I pointed out. I was your wife. Jacob was your stepson. We were your family, Richard. The primary one, not the secondary one. He nodded miserably. I know that. Intellectually, I know that. But there are patterns established since childhood that are hard to break. My father's approval has always been essential. More essential than our happiness, than our dignity? Richard looked genuinely tormented, caught between competing loyalties that should never have been in competition at all. I don't want to lose you. Either of you. But I don't know how to reconcile everything. I studied him. This man I had loved enough to remake myself for, this brilliant surgeon who saved lives daily but couldn't summon the courage to save his own family from his parents' prejudice. Despite everything, I felt a wave of compassion. He too was trapped in a prison of expectations, albeit a gilded one of his own maintaining. I'm not asking you to cut off your family, Richard. I'm asking you to stand with us, firmly and without equivocation when they disrespect us. I'm asking you to make it clear that we are a package deal, that loving you means accepting us, all of us, exactly as we are. And if they can't do that, then you have a difficult choice to make. But it has to be a conscious choice, not a passive drift toward the path of least resistance. He reached across the table, taking my hand. I want to choose you. Both of you. I just don't know if I can be the person you need me to be. The honesty was painful, but necessary. That's something only you can figure out. But Jacob and I can't keep living in limbo while you decide. We won't go back to pretending or diminishing ourselves. A heavy silence settled between us, filled with everything that had been left unsaid for too long. Around us, the cafe hummed with ordinary life, students studying, friends laughing, baristas calling out orders. The normality felt surreal against the weightiness of our conversation. What happens now? Richard finally asked. Now, I think we need space. Real space, not just physical separation. I need to rediscover who I am without the constant pressure to be someone else, and you need to decide who you truly want to be. How much time are we talking about? I shook my head. I can't put a timeline on this, Richard. It's not about checking days off a calendar. It's about fundamental change. He nodded slowly, acceptance gradually replacing desperation in his expression. Can I at least talk to Jacob? Try to explain? That's up to Jacob. I won't force him to see you if he's not ready, but I won't prevent it either if he wants to. I finished my coffee, suddenly eager to end this conversation that was opening more questions than it resolved. I should go. Mom's expecting me back. As I stood to leave, Richard caught my hand again. Olivia, no matter what happens, thank you. For what? For showing me what courage looks like. Through Jacob, through yourself right now. His eyes held genuine admiration. It's easier to perform surgery on a beating heart than to face the truth about yourself. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt a flutter of hope. Not necessarily for our marriage, but for Richard himself. Perhaps this crisis would help him find his own authentic voice, whether that included us or not. As I left the cafe, the December sun broke through clouds, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I walked slowly, processing the conversation, allowing myself to feel everything without judgment. The grief for what might have been, the anger at years of subtle diminishment, the fear of an uncertain future, but also a growing sense of liberation. By the time I reached my mother's apartment, I felt lighter somehow, as if setting down a burden I'd carried so long I'd forgotten it wasn't part of me. My mother opened the door before I could knock, her eyes questioning. "We talked," I said simply. "Nothing is resolved, but at least we're being honest now." She nodded, patting my cheek in that way mothers do when they're proud, but worried. "Honesty is always the beginning of healing, Mija. Come in. Jacob has been teaching me about meteor showers." I found Jacob at my mother's kitchen table, surrounded by books and star charts he'd printed from her ancient computer. His face lit up when he saw me, and he immediately launched into an explanation of the Leonids and how we could best view them from our building's roof. "Ms. Kennedy from the planetarium says this might be an exceptional year," he said excitedly. "We could see up to 20 meteors per hour." "That sounds magical," I said, sitting beside him. "Did you have lunch?" "Abuela mad chilaquiles, the good kind with extra crema." He hesitated, then asked the question I knew was coming. "Did you see Richard?" "Yes, we had a good talk." "Is he sorry?" The directness of children never ceased to amaze me. "Yes, he is. Very sorry." "But being sorry doesn't fix everything, does it?" I stroked his hair, marveling at his intuitive understanding. "No, it doesn't. Being sorry is just the starting point. Real change takes time and consistent effort." He considered this thoughtfully. "Like when I was learning to ride a bike. I kept falling, but I had to keep trying differently until it worked?" "Exactly like that. Some lessons take more than one try to learn properly." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. "Can we still go see the meteors tonight?" "Absolutely. It's a date." That evening, bundled in coats against the December chill, Jacob and I climbed to our building's roof with thermoses of hot chocolate, blankets, and his star charts. The city lights dimmed some of the celestial show, but the clear, cold air provided good visibility. We settled onto the old lounge chairs that permanently resided on the roof, remnants of some long-ago tenant's urban oasis. As we waited for the first streaks of light across the sky, Jacob nestled against me for warmth. "Mom, do you think the stars know when we're watching them?" The question, so characteristic of his imaginative mind, made me smile. "What do you think?" "I think maybe they do in a way. Not like they have brains or anything, but like everything in the universe is connected somehow. Like when you pull one thread on a sweater and a whole different section moves." I considered his metaphor, impressed by its sophistication. "That's a beautiful way of thinking about it. The quantum physicists might even agree with you. They talk about something called entanglement, where particles affect each other across vast distances." He grinned, pleased with this scientific validation of his poetic thought. "So maybe when we look up, something up there knows it's being seen." "Maybe," I agreed, pointing as the first meteor streaked across the sky. "Oh, look." We fell silent, watching the celestial show unfold above us. Each sudden flash of light drew gasps and whispered exclamations. Between meteors, we picked out constellations, telling each other the ancient myths associated with them. "Orion was a great hunter," Jacob said, pointing to the distinctive belt. "But he got in trouble for boasting too much." "That's right." Hubris, the Greeks called it. Dangerous pride. Like the Andersons, he said quietly. They're so proud of who they are that they can't see who other people are. The insight struck me with its accuracy. That's very perceptive, Jacob. Is that why they couldn't accept us? Because we're different from them? I chose my words carefully, wanting to honor his question without instilling bitterness. I think some people confuse difference with deficiency. The Andersons have a very narrow view of what makes someone valuable or worthy, but that's their limitation, not ours. He processed this, watching another meteor streak overhead. I used to want to be like them, all polished and perfect and knowing exactly which fork to use. I know, I wanted that too for both of us. But it wasn't really us, was it? It was like wearing a costume all the time. Yes, I admitted. A very uncomfortable costume that got tighter the longer we wore it. He laughed at the image, then grew serious again. I don't want to wear costumes anymore. I just want to be me. That, I said, hugging him tightly, is exactly what I want too. Just us, being authentically ourselves. As the night deepened, and meteors continued their celestial dance, I reflected on how often wisdom comes from unexpected sources. While I had been struggling to conform to the Anderson mold, my son had been quietly observing, processing, and ultimately rejecting the premise that we needed to change to be worthy. His courage at that Thanksgiving table hadn't come from nowhere. It had grown from his innate sense of justice and self-worth that all my efforts at social assimilation had failed to erase. We stayed on the roof until the meteor shower peaked, our faces tilted skyward, connected to something vast and beautiful that asked nothing of us except our attention. No performance required, no standards to meet, no approval to earn. Just existence, appreciation, wonder. The next morning, I called. The library where I'd been working reduced hours since marrying Richard. My supervisor, Diane, answered on the second ring. Boston Public Library, Research Division. Diane, it's Olivia. I was wondering if the full-time position in the literature department is still open. There was a pause, then Diane's voice warmed considerably. It is indeed. Are you interested? Very much so. I think it's time I came back properly. Well, that would be wonderful. The patrons still ask about you, you know. Nobody can find the obscure poetry collections quite like you can. The simple compliment, professional, based on actual skill rather than social performance, filled me with unexpected joy. I've missed it. All of it. What's brought this on? I thought Richard's schedule made full-time work difficult for you. I hesitated, not ready to explain the full situation. Let's just say I'm reclaiming some pieces of myself that got misplaced. The library has always been more than a job to me. Well, we'd be delighted to have you back fully. Come by tomorrow and we'll talk details. I'll be there. After hanging up, I felt a surge of excitement that had nothing to do with Richard or the Andersons. The library had always been my sanctuary, the place where I felt most competent and authentic. Returning to full-time work, there wasn't just practical financial planning, it was a reclamation of identity. When I told Jacob about my decision, his response surprised me. Does this mean I can go back to the after-school science club? He asked hopefully. The one Richard said took too much time away from my piano lessons? I winced, remembering how I'd acquiesced to Richard's insistence that Jacob focus on activities the Andersons considered culturally enriching, rather than the robotics and astronomy clubs he'd loved at his old school. Absolutely, and you can drop the piano if you want. His face lit up. Really? But Eleanor said all cultured people play an instrument. Eleanor isn't making our decisions anymore, I said firmly. If you enjoy piano, keep playing. If not, we'll find the time and resources for activities you actually love. He launched himself into my arms with such force that I staggered backward. Thank you, Mom. I don't hate piano. but I'm not good at it like I am with science stuff. Can I email Ms. Reyes today about rejoining Robot Club? Go for it, I encouraged, feeling another knot of Anderson-induced restriction loosen inside me. Later that afternoon, my phone rang with Richard's number. I answered, our lunch conversation having eased some of my initial anger. "Olivia, I need to tell you something," he said without preamble. "I just spoke with my father." My stomach tightened. "And?" "I told him that his behavior toward you and Jacob was unacceptable, that if he wants me in his life, he needs to accept both of you with respect and without conditions." His voice sounded different, firmer, less conflicted. I told him about Barrett's daughter, too, that I knew he'd been trying to orchestrate some kind of merger marriage and that I wouldn't be part of it. I sat down, genuinely surprised. "How did he take it?" "About as well as you'd expect. There was shouting, threats about my position on hospital boards, hints about changing their will. The usual Anderson arsenal of control tactics." He paused. But for the first time, they didn't work. I didn't back down. "What changed?" I asked softly. I kept thinking about Jacob, about his courage at that dinner table, about how clearly he saw what was happening while I was still pretending everything was fine. There was a new quality in Richard's voice, something like wonder mixed with determination. I realized I wanted to be the kind of man who deserves a son like him, even if you decide our marriage can't be saved. The statement hung in the air between us, heavy with implication and possibility. "Richard, I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything yet. I'm not telling you this to pressure you into a decision. I'm telling you because you were right about all of it. And I needed you to know that I see that now." After we ended the call, I sat for a long time, processing this unexpected development. Richard standing up to his father represented a seismic shift, a breaking of patterns established since childhood. Whether it was enough to rebuild, what had been broken between us remained to be seen, but it was unquestionably a brave first step. That night, as Jacob and I made dinner together in our apartment kitchen, something we'd rarely done in the Anderson house with its intimidating professional appliances and Eleanor's opinions about cooking aromas, I found myself thinking about courage in its many forms. Jacob's direct confrontation at the Thanksgiving table, my quiet determination to reclaim my authentic self, and now Richard's belated but significant stand against his family's toxic expectations. "Mom?" Jacob interrupted my thoughts, wooden spoon in hand. "I think I'm ready to talk to Richard, if he still wants to talk to me." I turned from the stove, giving him my full attention. "He definitely does, but only if you're sure you're ready." He nodded solemnly. "I've been thinking about it a lot. About what you said about change being like learning to ride a bike, that you have to keep trying differently until it works." He stirred the pasta sauce contemplatively. "I think maybe Richard is trying differently now, and we should at least listen." In that moment, watching my son's thoughtful expression as he considered extending grace to someone who had hurt him, I felt a surge of pure pride untainted by social expectations or performance metrics. This wisdom, this emotional intelligence, this capacity for compassion without sacrificing self-respect, these were the true measures of success. Not Anderson approval, not social standing, not any external validation. We had lost something at that Thanksgiving table, illusions perhaps, or a certain kind of security. But we had gained something infinitely more valuable, the courage to be fully, unapologetically ourselves, even when it meant standing alone. And in that courage was a different kind of security, one built from within rather than bestowed from without. As we sat down to our simple meal at our small table with its mismatched chairs, I realized with sudden clarity that I no longer envied the Andersons their perfect table settings or pristine traditions. What we had This authentic connection, this honest communication, this mutual respect, was the true wealth that no family name or inheritance could provide. 2 days later, Jacob sat nervously on our apartment's worn couch, fidgeting with the hem of his sweater as we waited for Richard's arrival. He had insisted on having this conversation here rather than at the Anderson estate, a boundary I fully supported. This space represented the authentic versions of ourselves, not the carefully constructed facades we'd adopted in Richard's world. "What if he's just saying things to make us come back?" Jacob asked, voicing the doubt that had clearly been troubling him. "What if nothing really changes?" I sat beside him, taking his restless hands in mine. That's always a possibility. People can promise change in a moment of crisis and then revert to old patterns when things calm down. So how do we know if he means it? We don't, not with absolute certainty, I said honestly. But we can watch for consistent actions rather than just words. Real change shows itself over time. Jacob considered this, his expression serious, beyond his years. Like scientific observation, you need multiple data points, not just one anomaly. I smiled at his perfect analogy. Exactly. One conversation isn't enough to prove a hypothesis. We need repeated evidence. The doorbell rang, and Jacob straightened his shoulders with quiet determination. I'm ready. When I opened the door, Richard stood there looking simultaneously familiar and strange. Familiar in his features, his stance, the expensive wool coat he wore against the December chill. Strange in his obvious nervousness, the uncharacteristic uncertainty in his eyes. He carried nothing except a small paper bag from the bookstore around the corner. Thank you for agreeing to see me, he said, directing his words to Jacob rather than me. This small acknowledgement, that Jacob was an independent person with his own agency, not just an extension of our marriage, registered as significant. Jacob nodded solemnly. You can sit down if you want. Richard took the armchair across from the couch, perching on the edge rather than settling back. He glanced around our apartment with new eyes, seeing it not as the temporary space we'd kept just in case, but as our legitimate home, filled with evidence of our authentic selves. Jacob's science awards displayed prominently my eclectic book collection overflowing the shelves, colorful throws and pillows in patterns Eleanor would have deemed chaotic. I've been doing a lot of thinking since Thanksgiving, Richard began, placing the bookstore bag on the coffee table, about the kind of person I've been, the kind of stepfather I've been. Jacob watched him intently, neither helping nor hindering the difficult conversation. The recording you played, Richard continued, his voice growing steadier, made me hear myself the way you've been hearing me. Not just my words, but my silences. The times I should have spoken up for you and your mom but didn't. You let them treat us like we weren't good enough, Jacob said quietly, even though we tried really hard to be what they wanted. Richard flinched at the simple truth. Yes, I did that, and it was wrong, deeply, fundamentally wrong. He leaned forward, maintaining eye contact with Jacob. I've spent my whole life trying to meet my father's expectations, trying to be the perfect Anderson heir. Somewhere along the way, I forgot how to distinguish between what he wanted and what I wanted. But you're a grown-up, Jacob pointed out reasonably. Grown-ups are supposed to make their own choices. You're absolutely right. Being an adult means taking responsibility for your own decisions, not blaming them on other people's expectations. Richard gestured to our surroundings. The truth is, Jacob, I was happier here, in this apartment, in the life your mom created, than I ever was in my parents' world. But I was too cowardly to admit it, even to myself. The confession hung in the air, its honesty almost startling. Jacob glanced at me, perhaps seeking guidance, but I remained silent. This conversation needed to unfold between them. The day we met, Richard continued, You were reading that book about Mars exploration. You explained the rover's design to me with so much enthusiasm. I remember thinking how amazing it was that you could be so genuinely yourself, so unworried about impressing anyone. I envied that freedom. A small smile flickered across Jacob's face at the memory. You knew all the rover names. Most adults don't know stuff like that. I love space exploration. Always have. My father thought it was an impractical interest, so I learned to keep it private. Richard reached for the bookstore bag. That's part of why I brought this. He withdrew a book. The Interstellar Age, Inside the 40-Year Voyager Mission, and placed it on the table between them. It's not a bribe, he clarified quickly. It's just, I saw it and thought of you, of the conversations we could have had if I hadn't been so concerned with making you fit the Anderson mold. Jacob reached for the book, examining its cover with interest. I don't have this one. There's something else. Richard reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a folded paper. I've withdrawn you from the piano lessons at Wellington Academy. Jacob's head snapped up in surprise. Instead, I've registered you for the winter astronomy program at the Museum of Science. If you want to go, that is. If not, we can find something else you're actually interested in. The gesture, so directly addressing one of the specific ways Richard had suppressed Jacob's authentic interests, seemed to reach my son in a way mere apologies couldn't. He opened the book, running his fingers over the glossy photographs of spacecraft. I would like the astronomy program, he said finally. But how do I know you won't change your mind if your parents get mad about it? Richard nodded, accepting the justified skepticism. That's a fair question. I guess you don't know, not for certain. But I can tell you what I've done since we last spoke. He turned to include me in the conversation now. I've informed the hospital board that I'm stepping down from the Anderson family seat. I've told my father that while I hope to maintain a relationship with him and my mother, that relationship will be conditional on their respect for both of you. I couldn't hide my shock. The Anderson seat on the hospital board was a position of considerable influence, one Richard had worked toward his entire career. What did William say? I asked. Exactly what you'd expect. That I'm throwing away generations of legacy, that I'll regret choosing those people over my birthright. He made air quotes around the phrase, a small but significant distancing from his father's prejudice. When that didn't work, he tried financial leverage, threatened to change their will, remove me from family accounts. And? I prompted, uncertain which Richard had prevailed, the one who had always yielded to his father's pressure or the one who had stood up at lunch. And I told him that while I'd prefer to have both my family's support and my integrity, if forced to choose, I'd choose integrity. A weary smile crossed his face. Then I called my personal attorney to ensure our finances are completely separate from Anderson family holdings, just in case. The practical steps he'd taken to back up his words registered as significant. This wasn't just an emotional declaration in the heat of an argument. It was a considered restructuring of his life's foundations. Jacob had been following this exchange closely, his expression thoughtful. Did it feel scary? Standing up to your dad? Terrifying, Richard admitted without hesitation. I've spent 42 years trying to earn his approval. Walking away from that, it's like stepping off a cliff. But you did it anyway, Jacob observed. Even though it was scary. Yes. Richard's gaze moved between us. Because some things matter more than fear. I should have realized that a long time ago. A silence fell, not uncomfortable, but weighted with the possibility of change. Jacob opened the astronomy book again, examining a particular page with interest. If you're really serious, he said finally, not looking up. Maybe you could come to the meteor shower next month, the quadrantids. They're supposed to be even better than the leonids we just saw. The simple invitation, offered carefully but genuinely, seemed to affect Richard deeply. His eyes glistened momentarily before he blinked rapidly. "I'd like that very much, if your mom is okay with it." Both turned to me, and I felt the weight of the moment. Not just the specific request, but the larger question of whether I believed in the possibility of Richard's transformation. "I think that would be fine," I said. "The meteor shower is visible January 3rd, if I remember correctly. That gives us all some time." Richard nodded, understanding my implied message. Change needed to be demonstrated consistently over time, not just in a single emotional conversation. "I should probably go," he said, rising from the chair. "I've taken up enough of your evening." Jacob stood as well, clutching the book. "Thank you for this. And for canceling the piano lessons. I really hated them." "I know," Richard said with regret. "I should have listened when you tried to tell me." As I walked Richard to the door, he turned to me with an intensity that reminded me of our early days together, before social expectations had eroded our connection. "I know I have no right to ask this," he said quietly. "But do you think? Is there any chance for us? Not now, obviously, but someday?" I considered the question seriously, neither rushing to comfort him nor dismissing the possibility. "I don't know, Richard. You've made a good start, but trust, once broken, requires more than promises to rebuild," he finished for me. "I understand. I'm not asking for an answer today, just permission to try, to show you both, over time, that this change is real." The humility in his request touched something in me. The Richard I'd first fallen in love with had been capable of this kind of vulnerability before the Anderson expectations had calcified around him. "I think we'd both like to see who you become when you're not trying to be the perfect Anderson. Heir?" I said carefully. "No promises beyond that." "That's more than I deserve," he said, squeezing my hand briefly before stepping into the hallway. "Thank you." After he left, I returned to find Jacob already deep in his new book, completely absorbed. He looked up when I sat beside him. "Do you think he really means it?" he asked, the question that had been hovering between us throughout the visit. "I think he wants to mean it," I answered honestly. "Whether he can sustain that intention when it gets difficult, that's what we'll need to see." Jacob nodded, processing this nuanced response. "I'm glad we didn't just go back to the big house right away. That would be too easy." "Too easy?" "Yeah," he said with that startling insight that continued to amaze me. "Important changes shouldn't be easy. That's how you know they matter." Over the next few weeks, as December deepened and holiday decorations appeared throughout the city, we settled into a new rhythm of life. I returned to full-time work at the library, rediscovering the professional satisfaction that had once been central to my identity. Jacob rejoined his beloved science clubs and began preparing for the astronomy program that would start after New Year's. Richard maintained a respectful distance while still demonstrating his commitment to change. He didn't overwhelm us with grand gestures or constant communication, understanding that rebuilding trust required patience. Instead, he sent occasional texts checking in, dropped off science magazines for Jacob, and once, memorably, had my favorite literary journal delivered to the library with a simple note. "I saw this and thought of you." No response needed. The Anderson family made their position equally clear. Eleanor called once, her voice tight with barely contained fury as she informed me that I had manipulated her son into betraying his heritage, and that I would regret using that child to drive a wedge into their family. I listened silently, until she ran out of accusations, then simply said, "Eleanor, Jacob and I wish you well, but we won't accept disrespect from anyone, regardless of their family name." Her spluttering response was cut short as I ended the call. William was more strategic, approaching the situation through intermediaries. colleagues at the hospital who casually mentioned to Richard how concerned his father was, family friends who reached out to suggest mediation. Each attempt was met with the same firm but calm response from Richard. His relationship with his parents was conditional on their respect for his wife and stepson. Christmas approached, bringing with it the complicated question of how to celebrate. In previous years, we had attended the elaborate Anderson festivities, formal dinner on Christmas Eve, carefully orchestrated gift exchange Christmas morning, obligatory appearances at various social functions throughout the holiday week. The prospect of creating our own traditions, unburdened by Anderson expectations, felt simultaneously liberating and daunting. "What did you do for Christmas before Richard?" Jacob asked one evening as we decorated our small apartment, with the colorful ornaments that had remained boxed in storage during our Anderson years. "We kept it simple but special," I told him, hanging a paper star he'd made in second grade. "Your abuela would come over Christmas Eve, and we'd make tamales together while watching holiday movies. Christmas morning was just us, pancakes, in pajamas, presents, games. Nothing fancy, but it was ours. Can we do that again?" he asked, his expression hopeful. And maybe Richard could come for part of it? Not the whole time, but maybe for dinner or something? His willingness to include Richard touched me deeply. "If that's what you want, I think we could arrange it." Christmas Eve arrived with a light snowfall that transformed the city into a scene from a holiday card. My mother came early, bringing her handmade ornaments and the masa for tamales. Jacob appointed himself her official assistant, following her instructions with the serious concentration he applied to all learning experiences. As they worked in the kitchen, I finished decorating our modest tree, not the 12-foot designer creation that had graced the Anderson foyer, but a living Norfolk pine in a pot that we planned to keep year-round. We had filled it with ornaments that told our story: Jacob's school projects, mementos from trips we'd taken, quirky figurines we'd collected from museum gift shops and bookstores. The doorbell rang just as the apartment filled with the aroma of steaming tamales. Richard stood there, snowflakes melting on his coat, holding a small stack of wrapped gifts and wearing an expression of cautious hope. "Thank you for including me," he said as I invited him in. "I know it's not a given." "Jacob wanted you here," I said simply. "And so did I." His smile, genuine, without the polished social veneer he typically wore at Anderson gatherings, reminded me of why I'd fallen in love with him initially. He had always been more human, more accessible, away from his family's influence. Dinner was nothing like the formal Anderson affairs with their perfect table settings and rigid etiquette. We ate tamales and my mother's pozole at our small table, using the colorful mismatched dishes I'd collected over years. Conversation flowed naturally, without the calculated social positioning that characterized Anderson gatherings. Most striking was Richard's genuine engagement. He asked my mother about her tamale recipe, listening attentively as she explained techniques passed down through generations. He discussed the upcoming astronomy program with Jacob, their shared enthusiasm creating a connection I hadn't seen between them before. "I was thinking," he said as we finished eating, "if it's okay with both of you, there's a special exhibit at the planetarium tomorrow afternoon. They're projecting deep space images from the Webb telescope on the dome. Might be a nice Christmas activity that doesn't involve my family's formal luncheon." The suggestion, thoughtful, aligned with Jacob's interests and explicitly creating alternative plans to the traditional Anderson Christmas, registered as another data point in Richard's journey toward authentic change. Jacob looked to me for guidance, and I nodded encouragingly. "That sounds wonderful," he said. "Can Mom and Abuela come too?" "Of course," Richard replied without hesitation. "It would be my pleasure." Later, after my mother had gone home and Jacob had finally fallen asleep, his excitement about Christmas morning temporarily overcoming his usual logic about needing adequate rest, Richard and I sat in the living room, the tree lights casting a warm glow in the otherwise darkened apartment. "Thank you for today," he said quietly. "It means more than I can express." "You're doing well," I acknowledged, with Jacob especially. "He notices the effort you're making." "And you?" he asked carefully. "Do you notice too?" I considered the question seriously. "Yes. I see genuine change, Richard. I'm just cautious about what happens when it gets harder. When the initial determination meets sustained resistance." "You mean my parents? Them, certainly. But also the entire social structure you've been embedded in since birth. The colleagues who expect certain things, the friends who share certain values, the institutions that operate by certain rules." I turned to face him fully. "Rejecting all that long-term is different from making a clean break in a moment of clarity." He nodded, accepting the challenge implicit in my assessment. "You're right. It's easier to be brave once than to maintain courage day after day, especially when the consequences accumulate." He reached for my hand, holding it loosely enough that I could easily withdraw. "But I want you to know that I'm committed to this path, regardless of the cost. Not just to win you back, though I hope that happens, but because living authentically, even with disapproval, is better than living a lie with all the privileges that come with it." The sincerity in his voice resonated with my own recent journey toward reclaiming my authentic self. "One day at a time," I said, neither promising nor discouraging. "That's how real change happens." He accepted this with a nod, then rose to leave. "I should go. Let you get some sleep before Jacob wakes you at dawn for presents." At the door, he hesitated. "Olivia, whatever happens between us, thank you for showing me what real courage looks like, through Jacob, through yourself." I was sleepwalking through my own life until Thanksgiving. As I closed the door behind him, I leaned against it, processing the evening. The Richard who had joined us for Christmas Eve bore little resemblance to the man who had sat silently at Thanksgiving while his father questioned our worth. The eye for change was evident not just in his words, but in his demeanor, his attentiveness, his willingness to step fully into our world rather than expecting us to adapt to his. Was it enough to rebuild what had been broken? I wasn't sure. Trust, once shattered, doesn't reassemble easily. But watching him with Jacob tonight, genuinely interested, respectfully attentive, making connections based on who my son actually was rather than who the Andersons thought he should be, had awakened a cautious hope. Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, the sun reflecting off fresh snow. Jacob woke me early, as predicted, his excitement palpable as we maintained our tradition of hot chocolate and cinnamon rolls before opening gifts. My mother joined us mid-morning, bringing additional presents and her infectious holiday spirit. The planetarium with Richard that afternoon proved magical. The vast cosmic images projected overhead, accompanied by scientific explanation of their significance, created a shared experience of wonder. Sitting in the darkened dome, watching Jacob's face illuminate with each new celestial revelation, I felt a profound sense of rightness. This, not formal dinners or social appearances, was the kind of family experience that built genuine connection. Richard seemed equally moved, his expression unguarded as he alternated between watching the cosmic display and observing Jacob's reactions. At one point, he leaned close to whisper, "I've never seen him this happy at any Anderson event." "This is the real Jacob," I replied, "the one who's been there all along." The days after Christmas passed in a gentle rhythm of simple pleasures. Jacob and I built snow sculptures in the park, visited museums, watched movies in our pajamas. Richard joined us occasionally, always with a specific invitation or purpose, never assuming or imposing. Each interaction strengthened the emerging foundation of mutual respect and authentic connection. New Year's Eve arrived with the traditional question of plans. In previous years, we had attended the Anderson Foundation's formal gala, a black tie affair that raised millions for hospital initiatives while serving as a showcase for Boston's elite. The thought of those events now, the careful social navigation, the performance of acceptable behaviors, the constant awareness of being evaluated, felt exhausting rather than enticing. "What would you like to do tonight?" I asked Jacob as we browsed the library's collection of holiday films. "We could have a movie marathon, or there's a family-friendly celebration at the Science Museum." He considered this thoughtfully. "Could we just stay home? Make those fancy appetizers we used to do, and watch the fireworks from the roof at midnight?" The simplicity of his request, harking back to our pre-Anderson traditions, warmed my heart. "That sounds perfect." "Could Richard come?" he added casually, selecting a DVD from the shelf, "if he doesn't have other plans?" The fact that he asked, rather than assumed, showed his growing understanding of our new family dynamics. "I'll check with him. But it's completely fine if you want it to be just us." Jacob shook his head. "I want him to come. He's trying really hard to be better, and—" He hesitated, finding his words carefully. "I think everyone deserves a chance to start a new year differently than they ended the old one." The wisdom in his statement, his capacity for both boundary setting and compassionate second chances, filled me with profound pride. This was the gift of our Thanksgiving crucible. My son was developing an emotional intelligence and ethical framework that no Anderson-approved educational institution could have instilled. That night, as the three of us stood on the rooftop watching fireworks bloom across the city skyline, I reflected on our journey since Thanksgiving. In just over a month, we had dismantled a carefully constructed facade and begun rebuilding something more authentic in its place. The process had been painful, disorienting at times, but ultimately clarifying. Jacob stood between us, his face tilted skyward as he counted each colorful explosion. Richard watched him with unconcealed affection, no longer filtered through Anderson expectations of proper behavior or achievement. I observed them both, these two people I loved in different but equally powerful ways, and felt a sense of peace that had eluded me throughout our years of accommodation and compromise. As midnight approached, Jacob turned to us with unexpected solemnity. "I want to make a toast," he announced, raising his plastic cup of sparkling cider. "To telling the truth, even when it's scary. And to family, not the kind you're born into, but the kind you build by being brave together." Richard's eyes met mine over Jacob's head, a world of meaning in his gaze. We raised our cups in unison, honoring the wisdom that had emerged from our crisis. "To truth and courage," I echoed. "And to second chances," Richard added quietly. As the final countdown began across the city, voices calling out the seconds in joyful unison, I felt Jacob slip his hand into mine. His other hand reached for Richard's, completing the circuit between us. Not a perfect family by Anderson standards, perhaps, but an authentic one. Messy, complicated, resilient, and real. The new year arrived in a cascade of light and sound, a fitting metaphor for the illumination that had come through confronting painful truths. We had lost the security of pretense, but gained the freedom of authenticity. We had exchanged external validation for internal integrity. And most importantly, we had demonstrated to Jacob that courage isn't about being fearless. It's about facing fear with truth as your compass and love as your motivation. The recording that exposed the Andersons at Thanksgiving had shattered, illusions we had carefully maintained for years. But in that shattering, something more valuable had been revealed. Our capacity to stand firmly in our truth, to reclaim our authentic selves, and to build connections based on who we actually were rather than who others expected us to be. As we made our way back downstairs, the echo of fireworks still resonating through the city, I realized that while the Anderson estate might have been a house, it had never truly been our home. Home wasn't about perfect table settings or prestigious addresses. Home was this, the space we created by bringing our true selves to each interaction, the safety we built by honoring each other's dignity, the love we nurtured by choosing courage over comfort. We had lost a mansion but gained a truth worth more than any inheritance, that true belonging never requires us to betray ourselves. That lesson, painful as it had been to learn, was a gift I would never regret giving my son, regardless of what the future held for our unconventional family. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.